I deixem començar per agrair la vostra presència i sobretot la presència d'André Lecours, que és professor de la Universitat d'Ottawa i director acadèmic del think tank La Idea Federal, i en Joan Botella, que el coneixeu molt bé, és el vicepresident de Federalistes d'Esquerres i és el degà de la Facultat de Polítiques de la Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. Deixeu-me breument que us expliqui com tenim previst que funcioni l'acte. Primer, André Lecours farà una breu presentació que hem distribuït en la versió catalana i castellana, que s'està distribuint en aquest moment, ho tenim per escrit. Després farà un diàleg amb el Joan Botella. El Joan Botella farà les preguntes en català i en anglès, i ell contestarà en anglès i jo faré la traducció no professional, però faré el que podré. Després una fila zero prestigiosa que tenim amb en Cesari Rodríguez d'Aguilera, catedràtic de la Universitat de Barcelona, la Montse Colldeforns, economista, i el Pablo Faura, dirigent de la Unió Europea Federalista, faran les primeres preguntes i després passarem uns papers perquè aquells que pugueu fer preguntes, i per facilitar la traducció doncs, també us demanarem que ho feu per escrit i jo les llegiré amb l'idioma que me les feu arribar, i si no és en anglès doncs les traduiré en anglès perquè l'André les pugui contestar i jo traduiré la seva resposta. I finalment passarem al vídeo del documental de l'Albert Soler i el Toni Sitges farà la cloenda de l'acte. So thank you, André, for being here. André is professor from Ottawa University and the director of the Fédérale Idea, the Federalist think tank in Canada, and I was explaining the dynamics of the event, and I told them that they have your initial presentation in Spanish and Catalan, and then you'll have this dialogue with Joan Botella, and then the first row of prestigious academics here will ask the first questions, and then the floor will have the opportunity to ask questions to you at the end. Okay? So thank you very much, André, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm so happy to be here. I think it's a great opportunity whenever people interested and hopeful in federalism can meet and discuss. Certainly as a Canadian, federalism is something that's marked my own political existence. And I guess I want to start with that. I want to tell you a bit about federalism in Canada in the context of its accommodation of Quebec. I think that's kind of the point of comparison here. And I think it's a good one. You know, what a difference 20 years make. Because 20 years ago, Quebecers were asked to vote on a very long question that, in essence, was meant to find out if they wanted Quebec to become an independent country. It's going to be 20 years on October 30th. After the vote, which, as many of you probably know, was very close, so 49.4% in favor of independence, or that voted yes. After the vote, there was a sense that independence was almost unavoidable, right? Because it was so close that many people hoped or feared that another referendum would be held and that this time a majority of Quebecers would vote yes. But that didn't happen. And so today there is some stability in Canada, but there is also what I call a paradox, and it's the following. The secession of Quebec, the independence of Quebec, is less likely than it's ever been in the last 40 years. That's one. Two, Quebecers feel less Canadian than they ever have. I don't have the numbers with me, but you can take my word for that. It's well documented, and the path towards a more important Quebec identity and a less important Canadian identity is pretty clear and is unlikely to be reversed. So it's kind of a good news, bad news type of story, depending on where you stand, of course, but it's a bit of a peculiar situation. I want to tell you a bit about maybe what explains this situation. I think the basic structure of Canadian federalism make it difficult for what we call sovereignist politicians who favor independence. I know the term is used here now as well, borrowed from Quebec, pretty much certain. The basic structure of Canadian federalism makes the argument for independence a bit difficult. Right? So at the most basic level, Quebec is as exclusive or near exclusive jurisdiction over many important policy fields. Education. There's no federal Department of Education in Canada. Healthcare, almost exclusively provincial. Civil law, completely provincial. Natural resources, owned by the provinces. The provinces own their resources. It doesn't belong to Canada, it belongs to the province. Policing, labor relations, and many others. There's also a very high level of fiscal autonomy. Right? So provinces, you look at their budgets, 80% of it is they collect themselves. And so about what we call own source revenue, that's 80%. And the rest come from federal transfers, which are either completely unconditional or very weakly conditional. So all this picture makes for quite a lot of autonomy, whether you look at it in terms of public policy or in terms of fiscal powers. If we look a bit closer, federalism is more than institutions, of course. It's also an approach to governing. And there's been a couple of different approaches, I would say, from the different federal governments in Canada. The Liberal Party of Canada has a view of national unity that stresses the development of pan-Canadian national programs. Their logic is that the government of Canada needs to be present and visible in the life of Quebecers so that Quebecers keep feeling or develop their Canadian identity. So at first sight, it's a coherent approach, but it's one that's had some pushback, let's say. And that pushback has come primarily from the government of Quebec, developing national programs in areas that are considered by the Quebec government to be its own, constitutionally, has caused a lot of tensions. So even if the Liberal Party is the federal party that's typically said to be most in sync or most coherent with the values of Quebecers, its view on national unity, the idea that the government of Canada needs to be very present and to make its presence felt, typically creates a lot of tension. The Conservative Party of Canada takes a different approach. This is partly ideologically driven. It's a fiscally conservative party, so it's not in the business of social programs, national or otherwise. But there's also a distinct approach to federalism that's come from the Conservative Party, which has been governing Canada for the last 9 years. That approach is that national unity is best secured if each level of government stays within its own constitutionally specified spheres of action. So we have in the Canadian Constitution 2 articles that basically state, what government does which thing. And the Conservative Party has decided to stick with this, fairly old document. That's an approach, it's called open federalism or the watertight compartment approaches, right? So you have 2 compartments that are completely isolated. Each level of government is autonomous within those compartments. And as a result, the Conservative Party of Canada has suggested that those governments really don't need to talk at all. So in the last 9 years, the federal government has focused on what is clearly its own constitutional spheres of action. Macroeconomic decision-making, the justice system, law and order, foreign policy, and so on and so forth. And I'm not a supporter of the Conservative Party of Canada myself, and what I'm saying here is a bit heretical, I guess, but I think there's been a bit of a blessing in this approach because it's really reduced the conflict with the Quebec government. So, two different approaches to federalism. I do think, although causality is hard to show here, but I do think that this watertight compartments approach has probably helped in reducing support for independence in Quebec, which, as I said, is quite low, but quite low in Quebec still puts it around 35%, so it's significant, right? Now, there's a possibility, though, that the decline in support for independence has come as a result of changes internal to Quebec. And what we notice here is that young people are much less likely to support independence than before. That's a very interesting development, because supporters of independence were always counting on the young, right? A lot of sovereignist politicians even argued that, as federalists, supporters of Quebec's continuing presence in Canada, get older and eventually die, independence will become feasible because young people are more nationalist. But of course now what we see is that it doesn't exactly work like that. You can support independence at 20, but then at 30, you have a job, you have responsibilities, maybe you're rethinking this a little bit. So that seems to have happened within Quebec. And as well, I guess young Quebecers now haven't experienced the traumatic constitutional negotiations of the 1980s, the 1990s, which were widely interpreted as a rejection of Quebec by Canada. So the discourse that they've been hearing is a bit different and probably not as focused on kind of a Quebec-Canada dichotomy. This being said, there is the issue of Quebecers' fairly weak attachment to Canada. Why is this happening? We do have an unresolved constitutional question in Canada. A constitutional reform brought in 1982 was opposed by the Quebec government. And so there's a piece of our constitution that hasn't been signed by the government of Quebec. And that's transmitted through generations, in high schools and the like. So even young Quebecers are well aware of that. And in the end, it remains a problem. So is recognition. You'll recognize those dilemmas and those dynamics. Of course, most Quebecers, most Francophone Quebecers especially, believe that Quebec forms a nation. Most English Canadians don't believe so. It's very hard to compromise on those types of issues. And, the difficulty of recognition has made it such that it's being evacuated from any constitutional discussions, which are also avoided almost at all costs. So, it's often been said that Quebecers would feel more comfortable in Canada if Canada formally recognized its nationhood. We obviously won't know for sure until it happens, and it's fairly unlikely to happen. And part of, the weakening Canadian identity of Quebecers is also the result of a very successful nation-building process in Quebec. Quebec is one of the most autonomous non-state governments in the world. It's very present in the life of its citizens. It deploys symbols, narratives, and that path has only been more utilized over the last couple of decades. When I go back to my hometown, Quebec City, the capital, I'm always struck at how everything is national now in Quebec. Everything is called national. This wasn't the case even 20 years ago. We had the National Assembly, yes, but now we have a national capital region, we have a national this, a national that. So that's, so of course, national for Quebecers is not Canada, it's Quebec. So there's been a huge success in Quebec's nation building process, and that's cross-party as well, right? So the Quebec Liberal Party doesn't support independence, but I mean, it's a bit, you know, the thinking is Quebec's our nation, Canada's our country. So the emotional attachment here goes to Quebec very clearly. How about Spain and Catalonia from this perspective? I mean, obviously, I feel like this movie, I've seen it before, about 20 years ago. Everything looks very familiar. Of course, from the outside, you look at this and you think, surely there's compromise to be found. If only because it seems obvious to me that there's much more room to go either within the system of autonomous communities or with something else. In Canada, in contrast, it's pretty clear that within the government of Canada, there is the feeling, and I'm talking about the civil service as well, and all officials of all kind, that we're at the end of a road. There's not much more to decentralize. There's not much more accommodation. If there is another referendum on Quebec's independence, it probably will be on either independence or the status quo. But I certainly don't think that this is the case here. It sounds to me also that, you know, the Catalan question comes in the midst of, or has triggered, a larger questioning of territorial organization in Spain and thinking about the constitution. So is Catalonia heading for a Meech Lake? This was the name of our constitutional accord in Canada in the 1980s, which, you know, I think, you know, constitutional discussions are important but dangerous at the same time. The Canadian experience from Meech Lake was that there was an agreement which in the end wasn't implemented for all kinds of political reasons. Politicians backed off basically because they felt that lots of Canadians were unhappy. And for Quebec, this was a historical moment. There was a strong sense that with the agreement, Quebec nationalism would change, right? From secessionism to an autonomous position. With the failure of the accord, the option of independence became much more palatable and led to that very close result of 1995. And years before this result, in 91, 92, 93, independence typically polled over 60%. What do we take from federalism in the Canadian context? There's many different varieties of federal systems, of course, but I think federalism is also an idea of governance. I think, you know, when I look at Spain and I think about federalism, what I would like to see is more dialogue, more intergovernmental relations. Federalism is self-rule and shared rule. It's a bit of both. And despite all of Canada's problems, despite the fact that our current Prime Minister doesn't like to talk to provincial premiers, we do have a dense network of multilateral relations between governments that's so well institutionalized that it really never stops. Even if a politician would want to end it, at the bureaucratic level, communications are constant. Most departments have an intergovernmental office that deal with contacts either with other province or the federal government. This being said, can't sit here and tell you that everything is wonderful in Quebec even from a federalist perspective because, part of the paradox in a sense bothers me personally as someone who feels both a Quebecer and a Canadian. I feel kind of a marginalization of Canada as a political community as a result of this process, and I guess wondering if some type of similar situation does not await Catalonia. Now, I'll finish by talking a bit about the think tank that I'm involved with, the federal idea, l'idée fédérale, which came from I'm not a founding member of it or anything like that. I was an academic recruited to give some content, I guess, to thinking about federalism through contributions from different, academics and public intellectuals and the like. But the concern of the founders was that federalism ended up with a bad name in Quebec, because federalism meant you opposed Quebec and Quebec's independence. And in a sense, certainly in those years, it meant that you were opposed to Quebec altogether, and that maybe you didn't like Quebec at all, actually. So, and it was very strange to me how I think such, in my opinion, a noble concept could attract such, hatred. So, we felt it was important to rebrand federalism by providing comparative perspectives. That's one of the ways we wanted to do it. Say, look, it's not just Canada who's federal. There are lots of different states who are federal, many of whom have problems. That was important for us because there was a sense that Canadian federalism, in the eyes of many Quebecers, didn't work. Well, federalism is an ongoing process. It's required for managing complex situations. It's not going to make these situations disappear. So it's a bit normal that when you think about federalism, you don't think of clarity and solutions, and it's a bit more messy than that. And to talk about how different countries also attempt to manage complicated situations through federalism, I think we felt could give Quebecers some perspective. So the main thing we tried to do is we publish kind of short pieces, longer studies. We organize events like these. But we face major challenges. We face some media diffusion challenges. So, of course, at l'idée fédérale, we are federalist. We don't even say it in terms of the Canadian debate, but because of who founded the organization and so on. So we have this kind of pro-Canada reputation, which means that we can send articles to some newspapers that will never publish it, just because of who we are. So that's a major problem. And money is a major challenge. And ironically, this might be different from the situation here, but funding the organization is problematic when independence doesn't seem very likely. And this is the situation where we're at now. We have a liberal government in Quebec, a government that opposes independence. Overall, the numbers for independence are not very high. Like I said, it's 35%, but we consider that not to be very high. So, we're seeking our kind of old donors, and they're like, well, there's no danger now, so it's all good, it's all fine. And, these are confessions on my part here, but, I find it very frustrating that, because we've been attempting to talk to people in the business sector and tell them that we're not an organization meant to fight, the evil sovereignists. That's really not the objective. It's longer term than that. But for many in Quebec who really are strong federalists and who have money, that's the role they would like us to play, which means that as long as there isn't a government in Quebec that works actively towards secession, in their opinion, we don't have much of a role to play. When such a government is formed, and it will happen again, then the dynamics will change. So that's a bit strange, right? Our organization is viewed by our donors, for example, in a very strategic way. They want media presence. They want us to have a clear objective, almost like a kind of a battle-oriented objective. So a bit difficult for an academic to operate in this context. I'll leave you with some of those challenges that we encounter as we try to organize events like these and forge links with organizations such as yours. I'll stop here.
Bona tarda. Jo tinc l'encàrrec no de parlar, sinó de fer-li preguntes una miqueta socràtiques al nostre convidat, i per tant l'encàrrec de fer-ho en català i després traduir-lo a l'anglès. Deixeu-me dir dues coses. André Lecours ha publicat bastantes coses comparant acadèmicament la situació d'Espanya amb la situació de Canadà, el cas de Quebec i Catalunya, i per tant, diguem-ne, està molt familiaritzat amb el que hi ha aquí, i m'atreviré a preguntar-li coses, diguem-ne, una miqueta més de detall, o que siguin una miqueta més divertides o més provocatives per a vosaltres. La primera, ell parlava de la paradoxa de Quebec, el fet de que hi ha més quebequesos que és una nació, però menys independentistes. Hi ha una altra paradoxa entorn de la paraula federalisme, que és que allò que s'inventa com una eina per acomodar comunitats diferents dona eines als independentistes per treballar, per trencar la unitat. No és casual que els últims estats que s'han creat a partir de coses que no existeixen, que es deien Iugoslàvia, la Unió Soviètica o Txecoslovàquia, que eren estats federals. En aquest sentit li preguntaré això, com se fa per combinar que aquesta acomodació no acabi per donar armes per una altra cosa? At the Federal Regional Study Journal, there was an edition catered to the paradox of federalism, which went creating a federal system does accommodate various communities, but at the same time it gives identity, resources, instruments to work, if basic loyalty does not exist, to work against the union. Is that the case? What is the what is the Canadian perspective about this type of federal paradox?
I think the potential for, and I know it's a worry in Spain, obviously, that more autonomy means that it'll be used to strengthen, the sub-state national community and will undermine statewide national unity. I think the potential is there for sure. I mean, we can't deny it. Quebec has the tools to promote its own nationhood. And in the end, of course, if you reduce attachment to the statewide national identity significantly, it poses kind of a natural challenge to the political choice that these citizens can make if they're asked to choose between citizenship. But my position on this is that the other options are typically worse. So federalism here, I think, is the least bad option. Okay? Not decentralizing power, not accommodating in that way. Perhaps in the very short term can work, but in the medium to long term, this represents more pitfalls, more problems than a process of decentralization that comes with federalism.
Okay. Ell diu que la preocupació aquesta hi és, que és veritat que més autonomia pot treballar per donar recursos als que la gestionen i laminar el que és la Unió, que aquest potencial hi és, que per exemple el Quebec té les eines per promoure la nació quebequesa i que al final això pot efectivament reduir la vinculació dels ciutadans amb el Canadà, la qual cosa planteja un repte en el moment en què els ciutadans els planteja l'elecció entre ser ciutadans del Quebec o de Canadà. Però de totes maneres la seva posició és que les altres opcions alternatives al federalisme són pitjors. En aquest sentit el federalisme és l'opció menys dolenta, que no descentralitzar, no acomodar, a curt termini pot ser una possibilitat, però que a la llarga planteja més problemes que no pas el federalisme.
El cas de Quebec s'assembla a moltes coses al nostre, excepte d'una. Quebec és més pobre que el polmig de Canadà. El que hem vist, en canvi, als països europeus els últims anys és que en les regions que plantegen moviments d'aquest estil són més riques que els seus respectius promitjos. Això passa a Itàlia, passa a Bèlgica o passa aquí. Un especialista ha explicat que s'ha produït un desplaçament d'allò que abans era la reivindicació lingüística cultural a la reivindicació econòmica. Li preguntaré com es lliguen desigualtats territorials, reivindicacions d'aquestes de rics i les respostes federals. Question concerns a difference between Quebec and the situation here in Spain or in other European countries, which is the fact that Quebec is, let's say, under the average in wealth terms in Canada, while what we are seeing here in Spain, but also in Italy or in Belgium, is that it's especially richer regions who are moving from the claim from language to money in their claims. Okay, what can be the links between these inequalities, these rich people claims, let's say, rich regions claims, and the federal answer? Is it necessary to have an attitude of promoting, supporting equality in territorial terms, or how much economic diversity can be accepted in the federal structure?
The challenge is to reach an agreement on the relative balance between autonomy and solidarity. The more autonomy constituent units have, inherently the less solidarity you'll have, because there'll be less redistribution. From that perspective, Canada is an example of fairly low solidarity. The idea of territorial solidarity is in second place behind another idea, that of provincial autonomy. So that's very clear. And Canadian federalism leans towards autonomy, sometimes at the expense of solidarity or equality. The federal government runs some social programs that benefit all Canadians. It also runs an equalization program that gives payments to poorer provinces. But in the end, a key idea in Canada is that provinces are autonomous and ultimately responsible for a great part of the welfare of their citizens.
És un repte assolir un balanç relatiu entre autonomia i solidaritat, perquè efectivament més autonomia de forma inherent implica menys solidaritat. En aquest sentit s'ha de reconèixer que el Canadà té relativament poca solidaritat, que ha afavorit l'autonomia per sobre de la solidaritat, que la idea de solidaritat territorial és secundària en relació a l'autonomia de les províncies. De totes maneres, sí que el govern federal doncs té una sèrie de programes federals socials i té mecanismes d'anivellament entre les províncies, però de totes maneres el federalisme canadenc clarament ha prioritzat l'autonomia per sobre de la solidaritat, perquè una idea clau en el federalisme canadenc és que al capdavall les províncies són responsables dels seus propis recursos.
Truly honest, if Quebec were one day to become one of the wealthiest provinces in Canada, which won't happen because it doesn't have oil, but if it were to happen, opposing independence would become very difficult publicly. Part of the reason why Quebecers stay in Canada is for very practical economic reasons. So let's say if Quebec were Alberta and had a lot of oil, I don't think I would even be here telling you about this, because I would probably be living in not a federal country. So I think that's, in all fairness, I should say this. So federalism also has its limits.
Anyway, Quebec does export electric power to the United States?
Yes, but it's not it's not worth as much as a barrel of oil.
Vol dir que volia afegir que si Quebec fos una de les províncies més riques, que no ho és perquè no té petroli, del Canadà, segurament oposar-se a la independència seria molt difícil. I que part de la raó que la independència no ha triomfat al Quebec és precisament per raons pràctiques, econòmiques, que els quebequesos senten que encara necessiten de la resta del Canadà. Que si per exemple el Quebec fos Alberta, que és un estat que sí que té petroli, doncs probablement no estaríem aquí parlant del federalisme del Canadà i el Quebec dins del federalisme del Canadà, perquè això ja no seria així. I el Joan li pregunta si no és veritat que Quebec exporta energia elèctrica als Estats Units, i diu que sí, però que el petroli seria molt millor.
Canadà és un país molt barrejat, no tots els francòfons estan a Quebec, no tots els quebequesos parlen francès, i hi ha molts francòfons a la resta de Canadà. Per tant, una qüestió és el federalisme, diguem-ne, extern, general, com es distribueixen poders entre províncies, però és interessant també què passa amb les minories encreuades, diguem-ne, què passa amb la situació cultural, lingüística, escolar d'anglòfons a Quebec o de francòfons a altres territoris. I wanted to ask you about the borders between language or cultural identities do not overlap borders between provinces. Mm-hmm. So you have English-speaking people in Quebec as well as French-speaking people outside Quebec. Yes. Okay? The accommodation within each province between the various language communities, the various cultures, let's say, how does that work? Is there, what type of problems do appear in this field?
Life for French speakers outside Quebec is very difficult because not only are they a minority language, but of course the dominant language is English, a world language to say the least. So the main tool of French speakers outside Quebec is a clause within the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms that gives to minority language community the right to education in their own language. Provincial governments have typically not been very protective of French speakers. But there is this constitutional clause that gives French speakers outside Quebec a chance to challenge a provincial government that would say, well, we don't need to have a school in French in this area, there's not enough people, so there's a judicial mechanism. But that's a bit the price of provincial autonomy. The federal government has nothing to say on education. So there is a Canadian federal language regime with these protections for minorities, but what we see is that the assimilation of French-speaking minorities into English is very strong. So that's another path that will be very difficult to reverse.
Diu que la vida pels francoparlants de fora del Quebec és difícil perquè l'idioma dominant és l'anglès, que és un idioma mundial. De totes maneres, la principal eina que tenen els francoparlants és una clàusula a la Carta de Drets dels canadencs que dona el dret a les minories lingüístiques a l'educació en el seu propi idioma. Que és veritat que els governs provincials no han posat molt d'èmfasi en fer complir aquesta clàusula, però poden ser desafiats judicialment a fer-ho gràcies a aquesta clàusula. Però està clar que les províncies tenen les competències educatives i per tant és un dels preus a pagar per l'autonomia provincial perquè el govern federal no té molt a dir en l'educació. I com a resultes de tot això es produeix una gran assimilació de les minories francòfones i és una realitat que és molt difícil de revertir.
I una última qüestió per acabar això i deixar-los al terreny a vostès, que tindrà que veure amb les integracions supranacionals, encara que siguin molt diferents. Nosaltres estem implicats a la Unió Europea, com Canadà està implicat en l'acord de lliure comerç del nord de les Amèriques. Per molts nacionalistes, aquests marcs supranacionals han ofert o han promès un marc més satisfactori per a les respectives minories, però d'altra banda, en sentit contrari, hi ha el dubte de si aquests organismes supranacionals no prefereixen tractar amb els estats més que amb els diferents territoris que els integren. De manera que voldria saber una miqueta com es situa l'experiència de Quebec-Canadà comparat amb la nostra. I would ask you about the creation of supranational institutions.
Yes.
Well, I know very well that the European Union and the NAFTA are very different things, but anyway, for a large number of these small nationalist movements, supranational integration was perceived as positive, yes, because it eroded old nation states, yes, let's say. But on the other hand, maybe those new international bodies prefer to deal with state, sure, rather than with provinces. So what is your experience about whether NAFTA has had any impact on these issues, or how you perceive the situation of the European Union in this aspect?
They are quite a bit different because NAFTA is only an economic agreement, and NAFTA for Quebec secessionists has served to make an argument that the costs of independence are less than what they used to be. In the 1980 referendum, the first referendum on independence, opponents of independence could say with a lot of credibility that there are dangers, that an independent Quebec would be isolated economically, and so on and so forth. By 1995, that argument was barely made, because even those who wanted to make it understood that it wouldn't work. Now, in the context of the European Union, I think that, membership of the Union is obviously important for Catalonia, and might present, if we look at the arguments in the Scottish referendum, for example, a bigger obstacle for those who advocate independence. So perhaps it works in different ways. In Quebec, more integration of a strictly economic nature, of course, I think has helped to promote independence because it seemingly reduces the cost of secession. But I think the European Union here, might discourage independence insofar as admission or readmission into the European Union might not be quick. Let's put it that way.
Diu que el Tractat de Lliure Comerç d'Amèrica del Nord i la Unió Europea són diferents, que el Tractat de Lliure Comerç pels independentistes del Quebec els ha servit per dir que el cost de la independència seria menor i que en aquest sentit hi ha una gran diferència entre el referèndum de 1980 i el de 1995, perquè el 1980 encara no existia el Tractat de Lliure Comerç i per tant l'argument de que un Quebec independent quedaria aïllat tenia més força que no pas el 1995 quan ja existia el Tractat de Lliure Comerç. En canvi, a la Unió Europea, per Catalunya ser-ne membre és molt important i per tant és un obstacle pels independentistes la dificultat inicial almenys que tindrien per ser readmesos a la Unió Europea i per tant en aquest sentit potser l'argument funciona una mica diferent. Així com la major integració comercial i econòmica del Tractat de Lliure Comerç facilita els arguments i la independència eventual del Quebec, la situació de la Unió Europea desencoratja la independència perquè la readmissió no seria ni ràpida ni fàcil probablement. Molt bé, doncs si us sembla passem a les preguntes en primer lloc de la nostra fila 0. Podeu triar entre fer el sistema Joan Botella, que és fer-ho en 2 idiomes, o si ho voleu fer en català jo ho traduiré a l'anglès o en castellà. Tenim un micro. Mira, això es pot repetir. Ha de pujar? Sí? Puja. Sí. Sí, no, ja està.
Bé, soc en Cesáreo Rodríguez Aguilera. En primer lloc, moltes gràcies per la invitació i m'ha interessat molt la presentació que ens ha fet el professor canadenc. Jo faré unes consideracions generals sobre el cas canadenc útils per a Espanya i al final li faré una pregunta molt específica. Considerant que d'entrada jo crec que Espanya i Catalunya han d'aprendre molt de Canadà, entre altres coses perquè Canadà té una democràcia de molta més qualitat que la nostra. Faré dues reflexions, una en el terreny simbòlic i una altra en el terreny pràctic, i després li faré la pregunta. En el terreny simbòlic és realment sorprenent per nosaltres i extraordinari el reconeixement de la plurinacionalitat de la Federació Canadenca. Més en particular, la resolució parlamentària de novembre del 2006 ha assumit que Quebec és una nació dins de la Federació Canadenca. En aquest sentit, el primer ministre federal, Harper, ha demostrat que és una dreta molt més intel·ligent que la nostra. En Espanya, d'altra banda, és molt cridaner l'abandonament pràcticament complet d'un terme perfectament constitucional com nacionalitats, que és l'article 2. Ha mort, ha desaparegut. Prefereixo que ho tradueixis tu. Sí, vinga, comencem per aquí.
He will make two considerations in general, and then at the end he will ask a question. He says that Spain and Catalonia have a lot to learn from Canada, mainly because you have a more consolidated and a better democracy. So his first thought is in terms of symbolism. He thinks it's surprising and admirable for us the recognition of plurinationality in Canada, for example, in the statement in 2006 of the recognition of Quebec as a nation. You understand?
I'll just ask you.
Okay.
I don't understand.
Okay.
Bueno, perfecte, doncs ideal. Estava parlant de una cosa que ens sobta, és que el terme perfectament constitucional de nacionalitats hagi desaparegut del nostre llenguatge polític. Per cert, entre parèntesis, jo li recomanaria a Pedro Sánchez que en lloc de parlar de singularitats, que no vol dir quasi res, seria molt millor que parlés de nacionalitats. És que per aquí no el poden agafar. Si té pànic, en aquest sentit, que no el tingui, perquè és un terme perfectament constitucional. D'altra banda, el terme nació és l'Estatut de Catalunya, no ha estat anul·lat, és el preàmbul. El Tribunal Constitucional només li ha tret valor jurídic, però no li ha tret valor declaratiu. En Xavier Vidalfol, que sento que no estigui aquí, ho va recordar no fa gaire temps en un seu article. Des del punt de vista pràctic, coses que podem aprendre de Canadà, la simetria del federalisme canadenc. De fet, l'estat autonòmic espanyol ja té molts elements asimètrics. El cas més paradigmàtic és el del foralisme fiscal basc, però no és l'únic. Jo crec que es tractaria de perfilar una mica més això. Segona qüestió, la llei de claredat. Ho trobo extraordinari per conduir l'autodeterminació. I parlem clar, l'autodeterminació. Deixem-nos de confusions com el dret de decidir, que no vol dir res. Decidir què? És un verb intransitiu. Parlem d'autodeterminació. Odone Lorza i Manuel Escudero han publicat fa molt pocs dies un article excel·lent, interessantíssim, al diari El País, fent una proposta de que a Espanya s'aprovi una llei de claredat per combinar dos principis inseparables, legalitat i democràcia. I finalment la qüestió concreta que li vull demanar al professor Leclerc. La qüestió de la simetria, a veure, canadenca. En algunes àrees aquesta simetria és molt clara. Per exemple, el dret civil. Quebec té un sistema romanista en comparació amb el sistema del common law anglosaxó. Però en altres qüestions, personalment tinc un dubte. Per exemple, ja sé que Quebec té un sistema de pensions propi. El meu dubte és, aquest sistema de pensions que té Quebec està reservat a Quebec o en teoria qualsevol altra província el podria tenir? Perquè aquí quan es parla de simetria, alguns volen considerar que, per exemple, Catalunya hauria de tenir competències que altres comunitats autònomes no puguin tenir. M'agradaria saber quines. Per exemple, Extremadura no pot tenir policia autonòmica? Per què no? Andalusia no pot tenir la competència de presons? Per què no? Aleshores, clar, només hi ha algunes coses molt clares. Dret civil, Catalunya té un dret civil propi, llengua, això està claríssim. Però jo crec que no pot haver-hi una barrera que prohibeixi a altres comunitats tenir competències que les altres que Catalunya té. Ho dic perquè, en el nostre cas, el cas espanyol, Catalunya, que ha estat el motor del desenvolupament autonòmic, cada cop que ha obtingut una nova competència ha produït un efecte d'imitació. Tots volen ser com Catalunya. Per tant, jo veig gairebé impossible consolidar dos nivells. Una autonomia, diguem-ne, entre cometes, de primera per Catalunya i el País Basc, i després la resta. Constitucionalitzar això és impossible a Espanya. Per això tinc curiositat que m'expliqui quina és la situació de Quebec en relació amb les asimetries. És a dir, són una cosa de fet o aquesta diferència està juridificada? El que té Quebec, cap altra província ho pot tenir. Moltes gràcies.
I think it is an important difference between Canada and Spain. There's really two sources of asymmetry in Canadian federalism. The first one is simply the reflection of the Quebec government making different choices. So, on a lot of social welfare, provinces are autonomous. The Quebec government has chosen, for example, to offer public daycare, nurseries, a public drug insurance program, which the other provinces have chosen not to do. So, but their constitutional powers allowed them to do so. So that's one. The trickier part is when the Quebec government has claimed federal power to be able to manage a program on its own. Your example of pension is what fits here. So what the federal government does, and what probably would not work very well in Spain, is that the federal government hears that the Quebec government, for example, back in the 1960s, wants to run its own pension fund. The federal government says then, okay, I'm willing to listen to any province who wants to run its own pension fund, knowing full well that only one is interested. But as a matter of principle, it wants to make it so that it's in principle symmetrical in a way, or everybody's got the opportunity to do this here. So that's a fine political line that the federal government needs to walk. And that would be much more difficult for a Spanish government, obviously, because you would know there would be much more than one autonomous community. So symmetry, already difficult in Canada. Asymmetry, already difficult in Canada, would be more difficult in Spain. There obviously is, in the Canadian Federation, a high distrust for asymmetry in other provinces. I don't know what it is. Is it the liberal ideology that says, okay, if they do this, even though we don't want to do it, we're not entirely comfortable with that. And this is something that Quebecers have expressed frustrations about. Right? Quebecers would say, well, if we run our own social program here, this doesn't take anything away from you in other provinces. But there's a sense that asymmetry involves unfairness, inequality. And that's difficult to resolve.
Bueno, inherentment la simetria crea un sentiment d'injustícia i desigualtat, i que les fonts de simetria que hi ha al Canadà són en primer lloc el reflex natural de que els governs provincials poden prendre diferents opcions. Per exemple, el govern del Quebec fa més guarderies i fa assegurança de medicaments, cosa que altres províncies no fan. Però per altra banda, quan el govern provincial del Quebec reclama poders que estan a nivell federal, per exemple, per gestionar precisament les pensions, el que fa el govern federal és dir que en principi escolta tots els governs provincials que vulguin gestionar el seu programa de pensions, però sabent que només n'hi ha un que ho demani. Però en principi està obert a que tothom ho faci. Actua sabent que la simetria es produirà en la pràctica, encara que en principi hi hagi un principi de que les coses han de ser simètriques. És una línia prima difícil de gestionar i que creu que en el cas d'Espanya seria més complicat, perquè seria difícil que no hi hagués més d'una regió que reclama els poders que en reclami una, que molt probablement no quedaria limitat a una sola comunitat autònoma, i que per tant en aquest sentit la implementació de l'asimetria seria més difícil a Espanya. En aquest sentit, però que de totes maneres al Canadà també hi ha desconfiança de la simetria, quan els quebequesos diuen que no hauria d'haver cap problema en que ells gestionen una cosa sense fer cap mal als altres, que això no perjudica a ningú, que ells gestionen una cosa que només ho fan ells, però que inevitablement els altres ho poden veure com un privilegi, com una font d'injustícia. Montse?
Moltes gràcies. Jo faré una pregunta curta que ja la traduiré jo, però la llarga, per si un cas, tradueix-la tu. Moltes gràcies per haver-me convidat i moltes gràcies al senyor Lecours per haver parlat de que quan les coses es calmin, doncs potser fins i tot aquí es podria donar la paradoxa quebequesa. Això ens dona l'esperança de que estem en un moment de maltemsada, però que la calma arribarà algun dia. Jo li voldria fer dues preguntes, una curta sobre el tema d'expandir una mica el tema de la llengua i després una segona sobre expandir una mica sobre el tema dels pagaments d'igualació i el finançament de les províncies. La pregunta sobre les llengües és, jo tenia entès que fa bastants anys una de les coses que va fer el govern federal canadenc va ser una llei de llengües que donava com a mínim el compromís de tot el govern federal de tractar amb igualtat totes les llengües, en aquest cas dues, el francès i l'anglès. I m'agradaria saber com es va portar a terme això i si això va, per dir-ho així, tranquil·litzar els quebequesos respecte de la seva reivindicació lingüística i com s'ho van prendre també els que parlen anglès. Maybe you want me to be a bit precise about this question. It's about the development of the language law, that it was, I think, already many years ago, and whether this helped for the Quebec people to feel at ease within Canada, how it was deployed, and how was the reaction of English-speaking people. That's the first question. Then I'll go on to the second point on equalization payment and financement.
The short answer is yes, that Quebec's linguistic legislations I think were essential in making Quebecers more comfortable. And if there was more angst, more worry about language survival in Quebec, and there is some, but if there were more, then the argument for independence would be stronger. Today, because Quebec has its own language regime, it's almost impossible for a politician who wants to promote independence to say, well, we have to become independent so that we can keep on speaking French as a community. I mean, that argument is made somewhat, but I think it's obvious to most Quebecers that French is well protected through the Quebec's language laws and in a secondary fashion, formal bilingualism in Canada. Now, ironically, of course, those language legislations in Quebec were not well received outside the province because Canada became bilingual at the same moment where Quebec made French its own official language. So there seemed to be a tension there. But again, that's something federalism can manage because you can have different language regimes at different levels. And of course, as I said, I think people who were upset by the language legislation now I think can take some comfort in the fact that it probably helped avoiding a stronger push for independence.
La legislació lingüística del Quebec i del Canadà va ser essencial efectivament per fer perquè els quebequesos estiguessin més còmodes dintre de la federació, perquè l'ansietat, la preocupació lingüística reforça l'independentisme, però avui realment Quebec té el seu propi règim lingüístic, té total autonomia per tenir el seu propi règim lingüístic, que consisteix en que el francès és la llengua oficial del Quebec. El francès efectivament també està protegit, com ha dit la Montse, pel bilingüisme del Canadà, però la veritat és que la resta del Canadà no s'ho va prendre bé, probablement perquè el bilingüisme del conjunt del Canadà va coincidir en el temps amb l'aplicació del francès com a llengua oficial del Quebec i per tant la combinació de les dues coses ha creat tensió. Però efectivament al capdavall la legislació lingüística ha afavorit que això deixi de ser un tema reivindicatiu pels independentistes quebequesos, perquè no poden reivindicar que no tenen llibertat per fer servir el francès, perquè en aquests moments la tenen totalment.
And just una mica més sobre això, tinc entès que molts polítics canadencs es maneguen bé en les dues llengües. És veritat això? Sí. It's true that they can speak both languages easily, all politicians, which makes things, not all
politicians, but I think it's fair to say that if you aspire to be Canadian Prime Minister, you need to speak French very well. And that's hugely important because politicians who have those types of aspirations typically not only have to speak the language, but they have to show Quebecers that they watch their TV shows, that they understand their culture, that they're familiar with their celebrities. And so it's not only mechanically learning to speak, it's something deeper than that. And one of the things about Canada is that, you know, in Ontario, anyway, the biggest province, people care a little bit that a political party can get support in Quebec. A lot of Canadians would be, depending on the province they reside, but a lot of them would be very careful before supporting a party that wouldn't get any support in Quebec. There's a carefulness here, you know. I think a lot of Canadians think or understand that a government that wouldn't be representative of Quebec in any way would be something very dangerous for the country.
Gràcies.
Perdó.
Diu que efectivament, encara que no tots els polítics parlen francès, sí que ho fan molts, i que en particular si vols ser primer ministre del Canadà has de saber parlar francès. Que no tots el parlen, però sí els que tenen aspiracions. I que no només has de saber l'idioma francès, sinó que has d'estar familiaritzat amb la cultura, els personatges, la televisió del Quebec i poder parlar de les coses que li preocupen a la gent del Quebec. I que hi ha un cert reconeixement per part de la ciutadania del conjunt del Canadà de que és necessari buscar el suport polític al Quebec, és a dir, que no té massa sentit ser un partit polític amb aspiracions al conjunt del Canadà i no buscar el suport al Quebec, que seria perillós que un polític o un partit polític important no tingués una base de suport important al Quebec.
Bueno, no sé si tinc temps perquè penso que igual ens allarguem molt i encara hi ha altres preguntes. Sí, la faré curta. Quan ha parlat de solidaritat abans i ha dit que la solidaritat era petita, per dir-ho així, o menor o no molt gran al Canadà, a mi m'ha sorprès una mica perquè la literatura sobre com igualar recursos entre les províncies i les discussions que hi ha hagut a l'acadèmia i a la política al Canadà sobre aquest tema és molt extensa i fa molt temps que dura, molts anys, i jo crec que han anat evolucionant amb això. Llavors hi ha un tema que és important que relaciona amb els problemes a Espanya, que és el desenvolupament de l'estat del benestar. Canadà va ser federal molt abans de que l'estat del benestar es desenvolupés i ara resulta que en la situació en què Espanya va entrar a l'estat de les autonomies i ara més encara, una part molt important dels recursos públics que a la vegada s'han fet més importants encara van dedicats a l'estat del benestar. Les pensions és però sanitat, incluïm educació, serveis socials i l'atur, la lluita al subsidi d'atur i les polítiques contra l'atur. Aquí a Espanya, un dels problemes de finançament de les comunitats de règim comú, Catalunya i les altres, no parlaré de les forals, és que sempre ha estat orientat a finançar la despesa, mai a repartir els ingressos. Els ingressos, vull dir, repartir els impostos i després, per si un cas, fer polítiques compensadores, sinó que aquí, a Espanya, el que s'ha intentat, malament i complicat i sempre fracassant, és estimar una despesa necessària i finançar-la, part amb els impostos que es paguen en la regió, en la comunitat autònoma, i el govern central complementant segons aquestes necessitats. Això vol dir que mai hem parlat aquí a Espanya seriosament de repartir-nos els impostos i després compensar les diferències, sinó que sempre hem volgut parlar de despesa a finançar. Jo em pregunto si al Canadà aquest exemple que ha posat de que cada govern provincial fa el que, en el que és competència seva, fa el que li sembla, per exemple, més medicaments, per exemple, en el cas de Quebec, més finançament dels medicaments que en altres llocs, això s'ho ha de pagar amb els impostos que recapta i amb el que el govern del Canadà, el govern federal, li doni per compensar aquests recursos iguals per tothom, com a mínim. Hi ha un mínim i després els que recapten més estan per sobre del mínim, no? Aleshores, la meva pregunta és, quan un govern com el del Quebec, que té recursos per sota de la mitjana, vol fer polítiques més gastadores, més de transferències, ho fa servir com a element davant del govern federal o el Quebec ja sap el que li vindrà del govern federal? És a dir, el Quebec sap que amb els impostos que recapta i una quantitat fixada pel govern federal, amb allò podrà fer el que vulgui. Però, com que aquesta quantitat que rep només la posa a mínim, és a dir, només l'iguala amb la mitjana, no li dona més recursos, em pregunto si la discussió sobre el repartiment de la despesa és un element de discussió amb el govern federal o no, o les discussions van sempre només per repartiment dels ingressos tributaris, els propis de les províncies i després el propi del govern federal que complementa a les províncies que estan per sota de la mitjana. O es parla també de polítiques de despesa, especialment de benestar, polítiques de benestar.
Just want to make sure I understand it clearly. Can you give me just a bit of...
Okay, let's see if we get it together. Okay, the Spanish system is based more on expenditures, right? There is a computation of the expenditures needed by citizen, okay? And then what the central government does is kind of filling the holes, right?
Yes.
Whereas the ideal system would be a system where there is an explicit sharing of the revenues, okay? Now, and then the question is, in Canada, for example, when Quebec wants to have this more generous welfare state, when they ask for more money to the federal government, do they know what they will get? In the sense that, are they talking about a specific system of sharing revenues, or they are asking about some level of expenditure like in the Spanish system?
Okay. I'll try to make Canadian fiscal federalism easy. There are 3 transfers from the federal government to the provinces. One is for healthcare. It's basically per capita. The other one is for social affairs. It's basically per capita as well. The third one is, I guess, the decisive one. It's called equalization. There's about 12 people in Canada who understand how this works. So I might be just the 13th, I'm on the margin, but I'll make it simple. So we establish a fiscal capacity for each province. That's the revenue side. There's no consideration of expenditure needs. So we establish a sort of average of fiscal capacity. And simply, provinces who fall below this average are brought up to it. It's a pool of about 16 billion Canadian dollars. And crucially, Quebec is always below. So Quebec always gets equalization. And there's a per capita aspect, there's a population aspect to it, because Quebec is a large province, it gets a lot of this money. So Quebec never asks for money. Provinces collectively can ask for more equalization, more health transfer, more social transfer. That's really done on a multilateral basis. That's one of the reasons why Mr. Harper, our Prime Minister, doesn't like to meet with premiers, because he knows he's going to be asked for money. But Canadian federalism works fairly well that way. Provinces can get together and put a lot of pressure on the federal government. And in a strange way, because of equalization, the wealth of a province like Alberta helps Quebec. Because the more Alberta makes money from oil, the bigger the equalization pool, the more money for the recipient provinces. So the system is, in fact, it's technically complicated, but in principle it's very simple because it's only 3 transfers from the federal government to the provinces. And the main problem from the provincial perspective is, of course, that the federal government can unilaterally change all these things. If it decides it's going to cut in half its transfer for healthcare, it can do that. And then the provinces, of course, their costs for healthcare are not cut in half. They need to find the money to do that. And then the federal government will say, well, just you can raise your taxes, you have that power, or you can cut in your programs. So there's a tension there. And this one aspect where provincial autonomy might not serve the provinces very well. Because if the money is cut, they're stuck with their constitutional responsibilities and they need to find the money to finance them.
Molt bé. El sistema de federalisme fiscal canadenc és relativament senzill, funciona a través de 3 fons, un fons de 3 fons de transferències del govern federal a les províncies, una transferència de salut que funciona per càpita, una transferència d'afers socials que també funciona per càpita i un tercer bloc de transferències que és el sistema d'equalització, que és difícil d'entendre, que diu que només 12 persones, potser ell és la 13ena, l'entenen al Canadà, no? Persones equivalents al Vegara i la Montse Colldefort segurament, però que bàsicament funciona perquè s'estableix una capacitat fiscal per província i aquelles que no arriben a la mitjana d'aquesta capacitat fiscal reben transferències per part del govern federal. Quebec és una d'aquestes províncies que sempre queda per sota de la mitjana i com que té una població molt elevada rep realment molts fons d'aquests mecanismes d'igualació entre comunitats. Les províncies en conjunt poden demanar en conjunt més diners i tenen molt poder per fer-ho, probablement per això el primer ministre del Canadà actual és molt reticent a reunir-se amb elles, però realment a part d'aquesta capacitat de demanar més diners sí que existeix un mecanisme molt senzill de repartiment que és aquest, que igualment el problema principal és que el govern federal pot canviar unilateralment aquest sistema, pot decidir unilateralment donar menys diners per cadascun d'aquests conceptes i que lògicament això crea tensió, però en realitat el sistema és relativament simple. Ara donem la paraula al Pablo Faura. Mentrestant, els que no ho heu fet podeu passar preguntes per escrit perquè les agruparem al final. La Mireia té uns papers i uns bolis si voleu. Si algú vol escriure alguna pregunta mentre el Pablo fa el seu comentari i la seva pregunta, doncs ho podeu anar fent. Endavant, Pablo.
Bueno, gràcies. Abans que ens darrer, gràcies a Federalistes d'Esquerres, que és també la meva sessió, però per convidar-me, perquè no estic aquí com a soci, suposo, sinó com a president de la Unió Europea Federalista, que bàsicament és una associació que promou el federalisme europeu. I m'ha cridat una mica l'atenció que veig que compartim un problema essencial. Tant al Canadà com aquí a Catalunya, com en general quan parlem de federalisme europeu, que és explicar què significa federalisme i què és federal, o sigui, el significat de federalisme. És més, el ponent ha comentat que havien de donar un bon nom, o sigui, dignificar la paraula federalisme i que encara esteu treballant per fer-ho perquè s'associa a ser massa canadenc, si no he entès malament, no? I aquí passa 3/4 del mateix quan diem això. Ho dic perquè a Europa, quan parlem de federalisme, si te'n vas al Regne Unit, doncs alguna gent et diu que no vol federalisme perquè significa unir-nos massa a la Unió Europea. nosaltres, fins i tot la meva associació, té problemes al nord, als països nòrdics, perquè el federalisme s'associa igual també a compartir massa coses amb la resta, sobretot amb el sud d'Europa. Però aquí pensem, aquí hi ha gent que pensa que el federalisme, la resta d'Espanya sobretot, pensa que el federalisme és desunió, i és més, és descentralització. El federalisme és això, és una idea, l'idea federal, penso que és un nom molt adient pel vostre think tank, no? El federalisme no predetermina si hi ha més o menys descentralització. El federalisme és sobretot clarificar, i és una cosa que crec que costa d'explicar, però estem parlant simplement d'això, anem a clarificar quines competències tens tu i quines competències tinc jo, i així no estem tot el dia parlant de què faig jo, què fas tu i per què m'estàs donant aquesta competència. O federalisme significa clarificar quin sistema tenim, quins recursos tenim per finançar les competències que jo exerceixo. Llavors, i d'aquí passo a la pregunta respecte al que has comentat en relació a l'evolució que ha suposat al Quebec. Diguem que teniu un sistema federal que s'ha clarificat en aquest sentit les competències de cadascú. Evidentment, després com s'exerceixen estan en discussió i es pot arribar al Tribunal Constitucional a determinar efectivament qui està respectant o no el pacte constitucional federal. Vull preguntar-te si el Tribunal Constitucional ja és respectable i respectat, i quin sistema, com heu aconseguit això, que les resolucions del Tribunal Constitucional del Canadà tingui prestigi, diguem-ne, per tenir autoritat.
Could you just repeat it, just so I'm sure?
Yes, the main question is how, first, whether the Constitutional Court or the Supreme Court, to what extent is respected and respectable in Canada, and how did you manage to achieve that?
I don't have a good answer for your second question, but I do know that that's one of the peculiarity, I think, of Canadian federalism. The fact that unlike in Spain, and I know this from my previous work on the Basque Country, unlike in Spain, the Supreme Court of Canada is considered to be neutral and impartial. There's a book, very recent, or maybe it's not even published yet, I evaluated the manuscript, by a University of Toronto professor, political scientist, who looked at the Supreme Court of Canada, and his argument, that would be his answer to your second question, that the Supreme Court of Canada is viewed as being neutral and impartial because it understands there are different conceptions of the country. It understands there's a multinational conception of Canada, there's a mononational conception of Canada, there's a conception of Canada as, where the government, central government should be very powerful. There's a conception where the provinces should be more powerful. So the argument of this professor is that the court has never positioned itself in these debates, but it's rendered judgments knowing that there's different visions of the country, which means that we often have judgments that are maybe for some not entirely satisfying, because it's not black and white oftentimes from the Supreme Court of Canada. But it's often judgments like the secession reference that manages to make both Quebec independent supporters and non-supporters and other Canadians fairly happy. So I think that's a great asset for Canada, honestly, and a fairly severe problem here in Spain from my perspective. How do you get there? I'm not too sure. I mean, there's probably in the appointment process, it probably starts with the appointment process. Now, Canadian prime ministers do appoint Supreme Court of Canada judges, but maybe they haven't figured out how to get a court that reflects what they want to do, because they don't seem to have to get that in the end, you know. So absolutely the Supreme Court of Canada is seen as a neutral and thoughtful body. Again, and probably the only downside, if you will, is that it often provides guidelines, principles, and then throws it back to the politicians and say, think about federalism, minority rights, liberalism, democracy, constitutionalism. If you want to think about a referendum on secession, you need to make sure you respect all those things. And it kind of doesn't go much further. So.
Molt bé, doncs. Efectivament, és una peculiaritat del sistema federal canadenc, a diferència de l'espanyol, i ho sap pels seus estudis previs sobre el País Basc, que efectivament el Tribunal Suprem del Canadà és neutral, imparcial i reflexiu, i és considerat com a tal per tothom. En el sentit que el Tribunal Suprem entén que hi ha diverses concepcions del Canadà, uns pensen que és un país multinacional, uns creuen que és un país mononacional, uns creuen que hi ha d'haver un govern central més fort, uns que hi ha d'haver uns governs provincials més forts, però el Tribunal Suprem no es pronuncia sobre aquests debats, sinó que emet reflexions, decisions que no són ni blanc ni negre, en aquest sentit no deixen a ningú en particular satisfet, però deixen a tothom relativament doncs, còmodes amb les decisions que es prenen, perquè no estan orientades a satisfer ningú en particular, que com s'hi ha arribat amb això, que no ho sap molt bé, que probablement hi ha alguna cosa en el sistema de nomenaments, tot i que els nomena el primer ministre, però no arriba mai a fer que el Tribunal Suprem doncs, pensi com pensa el primer ministre, que l'únic inconvenient que es pot trobar aquest sistema és que efectivament el Tribunal Suprem dona línies generals i moltes vegades torna el problema als polítics, com ha passat amb el cas del referèndum de secessió i de la llei de claredat, que emet una sèrie de criteris i després són els polítics els que ho han d'acabar de resoldre. Okay? Bueno, m'han arribat una sèrie de preguntes. Començo amb una que tinc en anglès, no? Diu, des del punt de vista legal, hauria el govern federal del Canadà respectar el resultat d'un referèndum de secessió que tingués lloc en una de les seves províncies? From the legal point of view, should the federal government in Canada abide by the result of a secession referendum in a province, or it just should take it into account with freedom to decide how to solve the question? O només ho hauria de tenir en compte per decidir com acabar de solucionar la qüestió?
It's a complicated question, obviously. And this being said, I know maybe we don't have that much time left, but I would like to also hear from some of you about referendums, which we haven't talked about much yet. I'd like to know maybe the position of some of you on that, on basically the question, should the Spanish government allow for a self-determination referendum in Catalonia? After 95, the federal government felt that the question asked to Quebecers was too long, complicated. They might not have known exactly what they were voting for. So it passed a legislation, the so-called Clarity Act, that basically specified that Canada's Parliament would judge the clarity of the question and the clarity of the result. That comes from the Supreme Court in part. It comes with no numbers. You know, what would the government of Canada do in the event that the result from 95 would be inverse, meaning there would be a very slight majority voting in favor of independence. I think at this point we could probably say that it would judge that majority to be not clear. And first, I guess, it would need to judge the question to be clear. And here we have a legal problem, because the Clarity Act is federal legislation. The Quebec National Assembly has also passed legislation stating that any decision on a referendum is entirely its own. It should choose the question, the process. We have two legislations. Not one is superior to the other. The Constitution is silent on this. We have a Supreme Court reference, but it's broad. So we could see a scenario where, if the question designed by the Quebec government is judged unclear by the federal government, then perhaps it doesn't participate. What comes out of that is unclear. If it chooses to participate but then feels that if the yes wins, the result is too close, it can choose to say it's not clear. So from the perspective of the Quebec secessionists, this is very frustrating, because it's almost like, okay, independence is hard to get, and now they get to oversee the question, and then they get, in the end of the process, to decide if this majority is good enough or not. Because the federal government doesn't want to put a number on the clarity of a majority. So there's apparent guidelines, but when you look at it very closely, they're not very useful guidelines. Because we could still have a process where the federal government decides not to participate because it doesn't think the question is clear. So we don't know what happens with that. We don't know what a clear majority is, so we wouldn't know what to do with the 52%. We're still in legal limbo, really. So
No té una resposta clara, perquè creu que el sistema no dona una resposta clara a partir de la llei de claretat, perquè la llei de claretat el que diu és que hi ha d'haver una pregunta clara i una majoria clara, però no diu exactament com ha de ser la pregunta ni quina ha de ser la majoria, i que per tant es podria produir una situació on el nivell federal no reconegués que hi ha hagut una pregunta prou clara o no reconegués que el resultat ha sigut el resultat que ha donat lloc a una majoria prou clara, i per tant, tot i que la llei de claretat i la resolució del Tribunal Suprem donen unes línies mestres aparents, la veritat és que ens podríem trobar una situació també en què el govern federal no se sentís concernit pel resultat d'un eventual referèndum i per tant en molt bona mesura segueix havent-hi una situació de limbo legal. Molt bé, dues preguntes, dues persones que les han firmades. Primer l'Argelia Caral, que és professora de Dret Constitucional de la Universitat de Barcelona, pregunta en castellà, diu: se insiste en decir desde algunos sectores que España ya es un Estado federal desde un punto de vista material. ¿Qué opina? Many people say that Spain is already a federal state. What do you think about that? Y segunda, ¿considera que existe un estándar mínimo necesario de solidaridad para poder hablar de un Estado federal? Do you think that there is a minimum standard of solidarity to be able to speak about a federal state?
Those are very difficult questions. I think in the literature we have this distinction between a federation and federalism. Right? So a federation is a state where sovereignty is constitutionally divided, where there's a division of powers that's written in the Constitution that cannot be changed unilaterally by one or the other level of government. I think from that perspective, Spain falls short of being a federation. But if federalism is understood as something a bit softer, then I think Spain qualifies to a certain extent as federal. This being said, there are federations where I find there's very little federal political culture. I would say in Spain there's fairly little federal political culture. But as I said, it's the case in states that are actual federations, the Latin American federations. So it's hard to position this concept in the debate, right? Because if you advocate federalism, somebody says, well, we're already federal, what do you want? Then I guess you need to have a good answer for that. I think, at the heart of federalism is this kind of dual objective of self-rule and shared rule, is the idea of dialogue between levels of government. And I think more important than any specific institutional configuration, I think that might be what Spain needs here and what Catalans want here. In terms of solidarity, is there a minimal type of solidarity? The United States, the Federation. There's, from my Canadian perspective, not much solidarity there. It's the only federation, developed federation, really not to have any kind of equalization system, for example. So I would have to say that varies tremendously. In the end, of course, I think any federal state would have some programs governed and administered by the central government that would ensure at least a basic level of equality and solidarity, but always understanding that the more territorial autonomy is important, the less you're in a position to achieve kind of a statewide type of equality and solidarity. What you do is you create two different solidarities, right? In Canada there is a pan-Canadian solidarity, and then there's a solidarity within provinces, because some of the social welfare mechanisms within provinces do work towards a type of provincial solidarity. I'll stop here.
Són preguntes difícils, que cal distingir entre la literatura distingeix entre el que és una federació, que implica una divisió clara de competències on això no està fixat a la llei i no es pot tancar fàcilment, i en aquest sentit Espanya no arribaria a ser una bona federació en aquest sentit, però també hi ha un concepte més obert, més tou de federalisme, i que en aquest sentit, en certa manera, Espanya sí que ho és. Però que sí que en algunes federacions el que es produeix és que, tot i que es compleixi amb la definició, hi ha poca cultura federal, i aquest pot ser un problema també d'Espanya, igual que de moltes federacions d'Amèrica Llatina. Que li costa posicionar-se en aquest sentit sobre si Espanya ho és o no, que el federalisme implica autogovern i govern compartit, i per tant el diàleg entre nivells de govern, i que això és més important que els detalls institucionals concrets de cada país. Respecte a la solidaritat, doncs la solidaritat és un component de les federacions, però també es poden donar federacions on el nivell de solidaritat és poc, com per exemple els Estats Units, que és una federació, ningú discuteix, però on hi ha poca solidaritat, i específicament no hi ha un mecanisme d'anivellament territorial com el que sí que hi ha en altres països. Que sí que un govern federal ha de garantir uns mínims d'igualtat i solidaritat, però també s'ha de ser conscient del dilema que això implica respecte a l'autonomia, que més solidaritat pot implicar menys autonomia. Que en tot cas al Canadà es produeixen dos nivells de solidaritat, un nivell pan-canadenc i també un nivell intern a les províncies que també el garanteix el federalisme. La primera pregunta del Joan Nieto diu: quina seria l'opinió de la societat canadenca, és una pregunta d'actualitat, si un president de província del seu país, similar a un president de comunitat autònoma d'Espanya, es manifestés davant d'una possible inhabilitació per un càrrec públic per una sentència judicial, si això s'estava plantejant, si la complia o no. O sigui, well, no. Did you read the newspaper today?
I was working in Madrid today. Okay, President Mas.
President Mas had to attend questioning from a judge.
Was the question what would be the reaction if the president would
if finally a judge decides to prohibit Mas from continuing his political career, would something like that be acceptable in Canada? That the judicial system decides that an elected politician cannot run for office anymore? Would that be accepted?
It's unthinkable. I can't even wrap my mind around that. So I don't even know where to go from there. I'm trying to think of the circumstances that would lead to that. I can't. I mean, presumably you would have to have been convicted of a criminal offense, but politically, you know, he would have left office because that would have mean he robbed somebody or something, you know. No, and you know, more broadly, I think you know, Canadian premiers, provincial premiers, are very powerful, and they typically can rally their constituents behind them. Certainly when they have a fight against the federal government, a provincial premier is typically in a better situation than the Canadian Prime Minister. So it's a position that has a lot of legitimacy, and that you don't attack easily because he or she represents the province, and there's, as I said, strong provincial autonomy, strong provincial identities in Canada. So to take on a premier is in fact to take on the whole province, and that wouldn't be wise politically, and certainly courts would never do that. So that's one of the most dissimilar points between the two states, for sure.
Okay. Bé, diu que li sembla impensable que això passés al Canadà, que un president un líder d'una província hauria de ser acusat de crims molt greus, no? I que probablement ja hauria deixat el càrrec abans d'arribar als jutjats. Que els líders provincials del Canadà tenen molta legitimitat i que per tant fins i tot més a nivell popular que el primer ministre federal, i que aquesta legitimitat és molt difícil d'atacar tant des d'un altre nivell de govern com per part dels mateixos tribunals. Finalment, hi ha una pregunta genèrica de la BEA, no?, sobre en general més paral·lelismes entre Quebec i Catalunya, quins altres paral·lelismes hi ha, i finalment una que no està firmada que diu: ¿no considera que el actual Estado autonómico español es muy similar al federalismo de Canadá? Una mica repeteix la pregunta d'abans, porque aquí también hay un alto nivel de autonomía legislativa, con competencias exclusivas o casi en educación, salud, derecho civil, aunque no se gestionan con un porcentaje tan elevado de recursos. Se trata de un tema económico. So the difference between Canada and Spain is that in Spain there is also a high degree of jurisdictional autonomy, for example in education, health, civil law, but perhaps the level of resources with which these areas are managed is lower than in Canada. Is then an economic problem that makes the difference that one can distinguish between Canada and Spain, perhaps, because in jurisdictional terms it's very similar.
This is true, but I think the point also in the question is that public policy powers without money, you know, in the end might not be about regulating, but certainly if it's about redistribution, protection, and that, a measure of fiscal autonomy has to come with public policy have really true autonomy. That's been a point of contention in Canada in the past. Provinces, despite their long constitutional powers, have sometimes found that they don't have the resources, the financial resources required to address them. Provinces, for example, have to run hospitals and education systems. Those are the expensive things. So provincial government have said, well, not logical that the federal government still has a lot of revenue generating capacity when the programs that need to fund really don't cost all that much. So it's an economic problem, but I think there's a fiscal problem. The two need to be in sync. Now, of course, in the end, central governments might be reluctant to devolve fiscal economy because fiscal resources amount to a lot of political power.
Diu que més que una qüestió econòmica és una qüestió fiscal perquè realment tenir més poders, més autonomia sobre àrees concretes no vol dir gran cosa si no es tenen els recursos fiscals per desenvolupar-ho, no sé que estem parlant de coses purament regulatòries, però si parlem de coses distributives doncs s'han de tenir recursos i autonomia fiscal per poder desenvolupar l'autonomia de les polítiques, que hi ha una correspondència entre l'autonomia en les polítiques concretes i l'autonomia fiscal, que les dues coses han d'anar, és inimaginable que no vagin l'una amb l'altra. Y finalmente, la última pregunta, que es, ¿cree que convocar un referéndum como tal y perderlo ha hecho disminuir el independentismo en Quebec? ¿Sería necesario en Cataluña? So, do you think that having a referendum, for example in 1995, as such, and losing it has diminished the pro-independence calls in Quebec? And do you think that that step is necessary in Catalonia? So we need a referendum and they lose the referendum. Do you think that it's a necessary step here?
Well, first of all, obviously we can't assume a loss. Right? These things are unpredictable. I was in Scotland last year and I saw the momentum gained by the independent side in the last month, so that was revealing. It's not that the 95 referendum has per se lessened support for independence, I don't think, but it's that there's a sense on the part of politicians who favor independence that losing a third one would be catastrophic. So it seems that for another referendum on independence to occur, there would be strong and long-term indications that a win for the independent supporters would be extremely likely. So that's really been the consequence of the 95 referendum. And interestingly enough, I'm hearing the same coming out of Scotland these days, that, you know, basically the argument is we might have just one left here, you know? So if we have it, we got to win it. We can't have one and lose another one. So I think there's a sort of conventional wisdom that that's not the type of thing you can have every 5 years. It's a very rare thing. And certainly in Quebec, I don't see a politician organizing a referendum on independence when all signs out there show that victory is improbable for them.
En primer lloc, no es pot convocar un referèndum suposant que uns el perden, diguéssim, sinó que pot passar de tot, que ell va estar a Escòcia fa un any i va veure la remuntada del sí a les últimes setmanes i que realment doncs, el sí pot guanyar un d'aquests referèndums en algun moment. El referèndum, ell creu que no va ser... el referèndum en si no és la raó per la qual ha disminuït l'independentisme al Quebec, sinó que és més aviat el reconeixement de que convocar un tercer referèndum i perdre'l seria una catàstrofe per ells i per tant necessiten una evidència forta i contínua de què guanyarien, i que això avui no es produeix. I que el mateix està passant a Escòcia, que els escocesos, tot i que estan molt forts, no demanen ara un segon referèndum perquè tenen la sensació de que els queda una bala a la recàmera i que no la poden gastar si no tenen la seguretat de que el guanyarien. Que un referèndum d'independència no és una cosa que es pugui fer cada 5 anys i que almenys en el Quebec en aquests moments no hi ha la sensació de que aquest referèndum el poguessin guanyar i per això no es produeix la reclamació en aquests moments. D'acord?
Mr. Lecours, for your excellent talk. We've been working hard, Federalistes d'Esquerra, to approach federalism to our citizens, and we have been tremendously enriched by the Canadian school. We have had here Stéphane Dion, we have had Jean Leclerc, we have you, and we are really, really thankful to you, to the Canada Foundation, for your support to our work, and la Fundació Canadà i la idea federal ens han ajudat molt a muntar aquest event. And finally, I would thank you for, I think, an axis idea that you gave us today. I'm not sure if everybody grasped your intention to rename and to rebrand federalism to the idea Fédérale. I think this is a crucial issue because we miss cultural federalism. And the main issue we are facing is that most of us and most of our citizens lack federal culture. Li deia que una de les idees d'eix que ell ha portat avui és renomenar federalisme per la idea federal. No és banal, perquè d'aquesta manera separa una mica les qüestions institucionals de les culturals. A les institucionals hi arribarem, però si no tenim cultura federal no hi arribarem mai. This emphasis on federal culture and the tension between complexity and simplicity, sharing and owing, double identity and single identity, mononational, plurinational, this tension, this intellectual tension that you gave us today, I think is the future, at least for those who want to, diffuse the culture of federalism. Because in the end, institutions will always find a place. But first of all, we need our politicians to talk on federal culture. And that's crucial. If we don't talk on federal culture, it's difficult to understand that we may ever have federal institutions in our country. And finally, federalism is an unfinished idea. Jo crec que una de les coses que més a mi m'ha agradat molt del Lecours és que ha pintat aquest panorama una mica fluid de la política canadenca, gens rígid. The fluidity of Canadian politics is something fascinating to us because in Latin countries we are more used to very rich schemes, and this breaks our ideas of a Supreme Court, for example. And I think we have to progress on that very much. So thank you again. Thank you to the Fédérale. Thank you to the Canadian Foundation. Marisa, Calais, thank you. Thank you so much for your help. And I think we can happily close this act. Thank you so much.